Well, welcome. So this is going to be a little different than just a straight presentation. This is our only slide. Enjoy. Um, we're basically going to talk about a recent feature development in Haiku, how the process went, kind of get into our technical debt, get into the nitty-gritty. And basically, our plan is to have our awesome panel participants respond to a couple questions for the first 20 minutes. And then with the last 10 minutes, we're going to do a group Q&A. So if you could hold your questions till the end, feel free to pop them into Slack. I'm sorry, not Slack. If you could pop them into the Zoom chat, we will get to them with the last 10 minutes. But to kick us off, I'd like to introduce myself and then introduce our panel participants. I am Kate Sewell. I am a senior software engineer at Notch 8. And I did not work on this project, which is exactly why I'm the moderator. So let me introduce you to our specialists. First, we have Jill Peterson, our project manager, who works for us at Notch 8 and has been managing this from the inception all the way to the reality. Next, we have our amazing senior software engineer too, Larita Robinson, who really helped drive the force of this development and can get you into all the code details. And then I'd like to introduce Nick Don Stanton Rourke, our Haiku product owner, who was able to guide this to actual fruition. So, what I'd love to do is, start out with our first question, and then I'll work my way through each one of the panel participants so everyone has a chance to respond to the question. Um, yeah, all right. So let's get started. Our first question that we're going to ask everyone is, what are your feelings regarding the way the project unfolded, and how could it have been improved? So I'd like to start with Nick.
Hi, everybody. Um, my feelings are I'm glad that it's over. It was I think a painful process for everyone. It was not a simple task. And if you just look at what, I mean, if you anybody who attended Rob's session earlier, the process of Valkyrization and knapsackification going on at the same time, it's a lot. It's a heavy lift. And we were, along with Adventist, we were first adopters. So we were kind of charting the territory as we were advancing in it. So it was a lot. We went way over on budget and way over on timeline. Um, and all of that raises the question, how could it have been improved? And I will defer to expertise from the developers on that. But my hunch is it could have been improved if someone else had done it first and we had taken all of the knowledge that they gathered from having done it first and implemented that, right? Um, because the difficulties, the complexities really emerged as we worked on it. So I think if we did it again starting today, it would be vastly improved because we would have that knowledge base. Um, and I think as we go forward, we'll talk more about the specifics of what they are, and I'm happy to happy to get into some very specific things, but I don't want to filibuster here, so I'll pass to I guess Larita next, probably.
Yeah, Larita, what are your feelings regarding the way the project unfolded, and what do you think could have been improved? Oh, Larita, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm muted, wasn't I?
You were perfect. Great
Yeah,
now.
I changed my microphone, and my microphone that I was changed to was muted. Sorry. I have a background in an organization that worked more of a waterfall process rather than the sprint process. So I am used to, for my first 30 years of development, doing a lot of analysis up front. In this case, that's not how it works. You're kind of driving the bus while you're building it. And so personally, that would have been my preference, is like we found all these gems that needed to be Valkyrized, and we didn't necessarily find the issues until we were pretty deep in the process. It's like, oh, this is a lot more work than we thought it was going to be. So like, like Nick Don said, it went over budget and time just because there was so much that we couldn't anticipate, because we couldn't spend, 3 months starting out of planning everything and looking everything in advance. And so that would have been my preference. I'm not sure that's a reasonable change, but that would have been, I would have preferred more analysis work up front. And I think that's the main thing I would say. I mean, I have a few other things that I had thoughts, but that was the main thing, is that I would just like to have time to look at it up front before we started.
Awesome. Thank you. Jill, what about you? What are your feelings regarding the way the project unfolded?
I am in agreement with Nick, Dawn, and Loretta. It was one of the more challenging projects that I've been a part of, but it is rewarding to see where we've come and what we accomplished. I think from the project management side of things, one of the challenges we faced was obviously the timeline expansion while also balancing our short-term business needs and the stakeholder expectations. Um, the technical scope expanded well beyond our initial understanding. And I think, like Loretta said, some of that upfront analysis could have helped with that. Um, but yeah, as it stretched out, it created some competing resource demands on our small team. We were constantly facing tension between resources needed for the Valkyrization work versus like our immediate business needs. Um, and so it created a lot of context switching with the team that cost us a lot of time and budget. Um, so yeah, I think something that could have really helped with this was, it's small but powerful, probably better defined milestones with very clear definitions of done. Hindsight's 2020. But I think we could have worked closer with the community and our clients to um, figure out those clear definitions of done and what the milestones could have delivered value-wise to the users. And that would have created a natural pause throughout the project that allowed us to shift focus to the short-term business things and come back to it with kind of a fresher, more stable mental state. Um, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts there.
Perfect. And actually, that leads me into the next question. Since you brought up milestones and organizing, and the next thing I was going to ask of all of you was, how is the communication throughout the project? Did you see any gaps that should have been addressed? Jill, I'm going to toss it right back to you.
Well, I think overall our team excels in communication. We're fully remote, so it kind of forces us to be over communicative, which generally works in our favor, especially on complex projects. Um, that said, I think there was a little bit of a gap in the documentation of our context and decisions. We're generally pretty good about documentation, but I think we lacked some robustness with our approach. And it was insufficient at times for the constant context switching we had to do. Um, like I said, we had to pause often to address other business needs. And we kind of lacked an established protocol for how to document where we're at and how to pick things back up whenever we get back to it. So I think we could have established some standardized documentation with maybe frameworks or templates with designated specific locations for the different types of information to pick the tickets back up. yeah, that's kind of the major gap that I noticed.
Thank you. Nick, from a product owner standpoint, what were your thoughts on communication throughout this project?
Yeah, well, I wasn't the product owner during the time that this process was going on, but I was hoping and anticipating moving into that position. So I had some of that framework, but I'd been working with pals on the Haiku for Consortia project for a number of years at that point. So I came in with a lot of, I think, broad community context. Um, but so just as the sort of client on this, because there's two aspects to communication, right? There's the internal team communication that Jill was talking about, and that's where I could see that the context switching was a difficulty, right? And when you're doing a lot of that, it creates inefficiencies because you put something down, pick it back up, put it down, pick it back up. Maybe different people have to rotate in and out on that process. But that became necessary as the project moved past its allotted time frame, right? So that wasn't, we didn't sit down at the beginning and say, let's design this with a lot of context switching built in. That emerged as a sort of requirement of Notch 8's commitment to see the work through, even as it got past the initial sort of time scale. And so there's a difficulty there. And that's all I somewhat opaque to me as the client. Like I can kind of see that, but I'm not privy to those aspects necessarily of the internal communication. There's also the Notch 8 to client, or in our case, Notch 8 to PALS communication, and what that consisted of, and something we should make clear to people who are external to this conversation and just listening to the panel is this project was not sort of a standalone project. Like we had a pre-existing long-term relationship between the PALs and Notch 8. And so we just sort of picked this up as the next project following. I mean, we'd had years of IMLS funded development work that we were working with. And so in that process, we had already stood up 3 separate communication vectors between us as the client and Notch 8 as our developer. And that was, we have a Slack channel for constant communication. We have the GitHub project board for constant communication, quality testing, internal to Notch 8, hand over to me for QA, and then either pass or hand back. And then we have a weekly, occasionally bi-weekly, but for most of the time that we've been working with Notch 8, a weekly sort of 30-minute check-in demo meeting so we can see the state of the work. And all 3 of those were really vital to the communication during this project, as they have been in general. And between the 3, I mean, I feel like we're really spoiled. We're getting a lot of opportunities for communication and different channels for where things will belong. Occasionally, I think, and this is probably mostly my fault, but occasionally there are inefficiencies of I should just create a ticket in the GitHub, and instead I go to Slack and talk about it, and so that that can the multiple opportunities for communication can maybe lead to inefficiency. But all of that said, I felt that the communication between us and Notch 8 was extremely positive.
Fantastic. Yeah, a lot of avenues create a lot of possibilities. And oh, yeah, if you could have heard our retro yesterday about getting clients to make tickets. Which actually leads us into Larita. You haven't had a chance to respond about the communication.
Well, Nick Don basically covered a lot of what I was going to say, but you just pointed out the one thing that I was really going to highlight. What is one of my biggest frustrations is getting reports of errors without enough background details. And like we would get, like, or the ticket would be made without the background details because the details were discussed in Slack. So, when you get to it, then you have to go search Slack trying to find the details or ask the additional questions. And the communication, having the Slack channel and the almost instant feedback back and forth, the responsiveness from the clients, were for not just Nick Dunn, but all, everyone that we worked with there was great. But that was my biggest frustration, is just the interplay between the Slack and the issue and the tickets, when you're dealing with bugs.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually kind of leads us into our third question that I was going to ask. So if you were to do this project again, what do you think you'd like to do differently, Loretta?
Well, my top thing would be having a list of the necessary features, that, it's like some clients want to be able to export in bulk recs, and some don't care. Some client, and one of the big things that we found after we went live was that the workflows didn't work. That it couldn't find the SIPity entities, so that was all broken. And we tested a little bit, and we assumed that the client is going to test a little bit, but when you're dealing with the complexity of moving from Fedora to Postgres, you have to have the data in the correct state to be able to test thoroughly. And so it really requires sort of a partnership of testing and to work on this specific issue and make sure this works, this feature. And it just slipped, it's not something we work with on a regular basis. So it wasn't to the top of our minds. And I don't know what happened to my camera, but I think
Okay. We can still hear you.
that's good. So that would be my thing, is like trying to look at some of the features that Hyku provides and just say which ones are the most important and prioritize this, and really just to make sure that we have the important things working that you use every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Clearly defined goals, always helpful. Yeah. What do you think, Nick? If you were to do this whole project again, what do you think you'd do differently?
Yeah, two major things stick out. One is we would not do this simultaneous with any other development. We would bracket out Valkyrization and knapsackification as this is the only thing we're touching until it's finished. Because we did have, we were really sort of through PALS, we were facilitating development for the University of Pittsburgh, a number of really complicated enhancements that they were looking for, and doing those simultaneously. And so we maintained multiple staging environments and multiple test and QA pathways and multiple layers of approval on the University of Pittsburgh work. And that also became a perennial topic of conversation at our touch base meetings every week. Is you have to talk about the pit work and you have to talk about the Valkyrization. I think doing those sequentially rather than simultaneously would have been what would have improved efficiency. I also we ran into an issue with the staging environment became continually degraded as we were working through it. We ran through an entire testing plan in the staging environment with newly created repositories and newly created data, right? Create a test work, create a test import, et cetera, et cetera. And then we did a migration of data from production and then found issues with that. And so that took time to work through. And then this was around the time that AI LLM bot scraping became just a bigger and bigger issue, for not just for us, but for the world, for everyone. And as time continued stretching out, you get into this. We're using the staging environment for a very specific purpose, and we're almost at the end. So, like performance was rough. It would, I mean, during demo meetings, it would time out when we were trying to screen share to show each other between us and the devs what was going on with specific issues. It was a really difficult to work in. And so then that makes testing really difficult because the question is, so I'm seeing this odd behavior or these things that are happening. Is this because of the Valkyrization? Is this because of just issues with the testing environment? Is this because the data migration affected things, but this won't be? Yeah. So I would have stopped and done a reset on the testing environment earlier, but at no point, I mean, that doesn't make sense if you're, a week out and you're never going to use it again. But then, that time frame kept getting a little bit extended, a little bit extended, a little bit extended. So we ended up relying on an increasingly difficult to work with staging environment as the time stretched, right? So I wish, hindsight being 2020, I wish we had made an executive call, 6 months earlier to just abandon and completely rebuild and to re-import the data and to do all of that. But it wasn't clear at that time that would have been such a lifesaver. But in retrospect, I think it would have been really helpful.
Hindsight. Exactly. Yeah. I don't want to cut too much into our group Q&A, but Jill, you haven't had a chance to respond to the what would you do differently?
I'm going to go on my milestone soapbox again. I think we approached Valkyrization kind of as a whole system transformation. And so now I would advocate for structuring it into distinct milestones for Valkyrizing components or Valkyrizing functionalities instead. I think it would have made the scope more manageable for our team. They would have been able to focus on one component at a time instead of having to split off and try and understand the whole system as a whole all at once. And then, like I said earlier, it would have created those natural pauses that we could tend to both sides of the long-term project of Valkyrization and our business needs. Yeah.
Thank you. Since we've gone a little over, probably because I had that long intro, that didn't help. I would like to open it up to group questions. And the first one I see in the chat is from Shayna. Would Nick recommend Valkyrization and knapsack to others?
1000% I would recommend knapsack without hesitation. The upgrade path that we've had in the couple of upgraded, fairly, not jumping multiple version numbers, but the upgrade path that we've had since we've had knapsack in place has been so seamless as to be essentially invisible, which has been compared to the upgrade path pre-knapsack has been an absolute delight. And the first time it happened, I was I don't know, I could not believe my eyes. It was fantastic. So knapsack unreservedly. It's difficult from the front end user side to say about Valkyrization because the time we're looking at maybe it was about a 6-month process, the whole Valkyrization, knapsackification work. And just so much has changed during that time. The rise of bot scraping being a major problem, getting behind Cloudflare, and then doing the transition. That it's difficult to say what the performance is like for for an admin user or for the end user in the public side doing browsing, how much better it is, or if it's sort of a Red Queen, running as fast as you can to stay in the same place kind of situation, because the environmental variables have just changed with that. But I'm not dealing with the code, so I'm sure I'm sure there's relevance to being on Postgres versus Fedora that are invisible to me as the end user. So, um, I think I will on those aspects I'll defer. But overall, we are really happy with the state of our Haiku implementation at this point on Valkyrie and on Knapsack.
Fantastic. Cool. Are there any other group questions from the community in the chat? I have backup questions if not. Going once.
I really appreciate everyone's candor. If you know offhand, what was their sort of original expected timeline and what was the ultimate timeline?
Jill, do you want to take a crack at that?
I believe the original timeline was around 10 weeks is what we were expecting. Two-ish months, 2 to 3 months.
Yeah, and it ended up being, what, about 8 months? We're looking at July to early February, I think is what it panned out being. And I don't know, do you have a sense, Notch 8 folks, of now that you've done this a couple of times for different projects, of of how differently you would expect it to go in a, similarly complex, right? An implementation already, already exists, active users during the development time. Would you just sketch out like, no, this is going to be 6 months, or have you, having done it a couple times, found efficiencies that would make it more like the original estimate?
I would expect it to be a lot less because we dealt with so many issues between doing it for PALS and doing it for Adventist that I can't imagine we'll find that many more things that haven't been appropriately Valkyrized and aren't working correctly. Especially with PALS, a lot of the custom code, I mean the code from that you contributed back to Hyku. So we found a lot of things that hadn't been contributed back that were still in your repo, but had gotten missed from contributing back. So even though I think we started Adventist first, there was so much more that we found that wasn't working right when we got into PALS. And now that we've done that, I think the majority of what we did will have covered it. There's the biggest part going forward, I think, will be the portion that Rob mentioned a few talks back, where we split the current repo into which parts are Hyku and which parts are your custom stuff. And that is a big chunk of time and a huge amount of work. But once it's done, then making the decision, can we contribute this back to Hyku, even if it's behind a feature flag or something like that? And really doing, making those decisions is that is the easy part of the work. And I think, knowing that Hyku is basically pretty stable in the Valkyrized mode now, I think we have some issues dealing with bulk recs that we're working on. But I feel like we're in a really good state going forward for future development work.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you three so much for your candor and for letting me poke your brains all publicly and such. Really appreciate you going on this adventure with us and sharing this with the community.